On April 3rd, 1898, a wall of snow half the size of a mountain came down on top of 200 men and never gave most of them a chance to move. It happened in under a minute. 1 second, there was a line of stampeders climbing toward a gold field they had crossed a continent to reach. The next, there was nothing but white and silence, and men digging with bare hands into snow, packed hard enough to break a shovel. 65 of them didn't come back up, but a smaller group did. A group that hours earlier had stood at the bottom of that same trail and turned around because an old man who had lived his entire life on that mountain looked at the sky, looked at the snow, and told them not to go. They listened. Everyone else didn't. And that single decision, made in the space of a few minutes at the foot of a frozen pass in Alaska, is the difference between the men who are buried on that mountain today and the men who went home rich. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly what that old man saw that morning that 100 desperate gold seekers couldn't. You'll understand how a route through one of the deadliest mountain passes in North American history was carried, unwritten, inside the memory of people who had never lost a single guide to it in generations. And you'll understand why, on the one morning it mattered most, almost nobody listened. This isn't a story about gold. It's a story about the difference between knowing a mountain and just wanting to cross it. In the summer of 1897, a ship called the Portland docked in Seattle, carrying what newspapers immediately called a ton of gold. It wasn't an exaggeration. Miners walked off that ship with suitcases and jam jars full of nuggets, pulled out of a creek in the Yukon most Americans had never heard of, a place called Bonanza Creek. Within days, the news had reached every major city on the continent. Within weeks, it had triggered one of the largest and fastest mass migrations in North American history. 100,000 people set out for the Klondike. Roughly 30,000 of them actually made it, and almost every one of them, whether they knew it yet or not, had to go through a single mountain pass to get there. That pass was the Chilkoot. It rose from a coastal inlet in Alaska, climbed nearly 1,000 meters through glaciers and loose rock, and dropped into Canadian territory on the other side, where the headwaters of the Yukon River could finally carry a man toward Dawson City and the gold fields beyond. The Canadian government required every stampeder to bring a full year's worth of supplies before crossing into the Yukon, close to a ton of food and gear per person, which meant most men didn't cross the Chilkoot once. They crossed it 30 or 40 times, carrying loads on their backs up a slope so steep in its final stretch that they nicknamed it the Golden Stairs, because from a distance, the line of climbers looked like a staircase of men cut into the mountainside. It was already one of the hardest physical ordeals most of them would ever face. What almost none of them understood, at least not at first, was that the mountain they were fighting had rules, and the people who had lived beside it for generations already knew every one of them. Long before the first American prospectors set foot on the Chilkoot, it belonged to the Tlingit, a coastal people who had controlled trade through that pass for centuries, moving goods between the interior and the sea long before anyone called it a gold rush trail. When the stampede began, many Tlingit men and women worked as professional packers, carrying loads up the pass for pay, sometimes as much as $1 a pound on the steepest stretches near the summit, a price that sounded outrageous to newcomers until they tried the climb themselves and understood exactly what they were paying for. It wasn't just strength. It was knowledge built over lifetimes, passed from parent to child the way any hard-won survival skill is passed down, about which slopes held snow safely and which ones didn't, about what kind of morning turned dangerous by noon, about when the mountain was simply not to be climbed at all, no matter how many men were waiting in line behind you with gold on their minds. That knowledge would matter more than anyone realized, because by the spring of 1898, the Chilkoot Trail wasn't just crowded. It was a bottleneck of human desperation. Thousands of stampeders backed up along a narrow mountain corridor, most of them completely unfamiliar with snow country, all of them racing a calendar. The Yukon River would only stay open for a few more months before freezing solid again, and every day spent waiting at the base of the pass was a day closer to missing the season entirely. That pressure was about to collide with a mountain that had spent 2 weeks quietly loading itself with the exact conditions it needed to kill. The end of March 1898 brought heavy snowfall to the upper Chilkoot, storm after storm stacking fresh powder on top of older layers that hadn't had time to settle. To anyone who understood snowpack, that alone was a warning sign. Then, in the first days of April, the weather flipped. cold gave way to a sudden warm wind blowing up from the coast, the kind of temperature swing that softens the top of a snowpack while the layers underneath stay cold, brittle, and completely unstable. It is, to this day, one of the most classic and most dangerous avalanche setups in mountain science. Nobody in 1898 had that vocabulary for it, but the people who had watched this mountain behave this way for generations didn't need the vocabulary. They just knew what was coming. On the morning of April 3rd, Palm Sunday, the storm briefly broke. Clear skies, warm air. After days of being stuck in their tents at Sheep Camp, the staging point below the final ascent, hundreds of stampeders looked up at that sudden window of good weather and saw exactly one thing: a chance to finally move. Tlingit packers looked at the same sky and saw something else entirely. They refused to climb, not some of them. Not with hesitation. They flatly declined to go up that day and told the men paying them why. The mountain had too much new snow sitting on top of old snow, warmed too fast on slopes too steep, and the wind coming up from the water only made it worse. It wasn't superstition. It was a reading of conditions built from knowledge no weather service in North America possessed yet, because no weather service in North America had spent 3 generations watching exactly this mountain. Some stampeders heard that and made a choice most people don't like to think too hard about afterward. They turned back. A handful of parties, some guided directly by the warnings of Tlingit packers who explained precisely what they were seeing in the snow and why it meant staying put, packed up their gear at Sheep Camp and waited the day out. It cost them nothing but time, but had they known exactly what that decision was about to save them from, waiting would have felt like the easiest choice they ever made, because most of the trail didn't wait. Roughly 200 people that morning decided the break in the weather was too good to waste and started up toward the summit. And the mountain, which had been holding its breath for 2 weeks, was done waiting too. The first slide came just after 10 in the morning, a smaller avalanche that buried around 20 people camped near a section of the trail called the Scales. It wasn't fatal. Other stampeders dug frantically and pulled every one of them out alive, a brutal reminder of how fast conditions were deteriorating, but not yet the disaster the day would become. A construction crew working on a tramway higher up the pass, alarmed by what they'd just witnessed, decided to abandon their work site and head down to safety. That decision, made for the right reasons, walked them directly into the next slide and killed the entire crew. Then came the one that would define the day: a long line of roughly 200 stampeders, roped together for safety in the low visibility, followed the fresh tracks left by that same construction crew down toward its Sheep Camp, walking single file across an open slope that had already proven twice that morning exactly what it was capable of doing. The third avalanche hit that line directly. It buried dozens of people at once under snow packed so dense by the force of the slide that survivors described trying to dig with their hands and barely scratching the surface for hours. Search parties worked for days afterward, using long steel probes to locate bodies under snow that in places had set almost like concrete. When the counting was finally done, the number of dead from that single Palm Sunday stood at somewhere between 63 and 70 people, depending on which record you trust, in a stretch of trail barely a mile long. It remains, to this day, the deadliest single event of the entire Klondike Gold Rush. What makes the Palm Sunday avalanche impossible to file away as simple bad luck is what happened in the hours before it. This wasn't a mountain that struck without warning. It was a mountain that gave a very clear warning to a very specific group of people who understood exactly what they were looking at and said so out loud. The tragedy isn't that nobody knew. The tragedy is that the people who did know weren't the ones making the final call about who climbed that morning. For the men and women who did listen, that pass had never been a mystery in the first place. Tlingit guides moving parties safely through the Chilkoot didn't rely on luck or hope. They read the mountain the way a sailor reads a coastline, constantly, in real time, adjusting the route to conditions that could change within hours. Later, accounts from packers and stampeders who survived that season described guides who, when the safest line up a slope shifted after a storm, would physically walk it out first, sometimes sketching the new path directly into the snow at their feet so the party following behind could see with their own eyes exactly where to step and where not to. It wasn't a map drawn once and memorized. It was a map remade every single day the mountain demanded it, because the old one was already wrong by morning. That's what separates the parties who crossed the Chilkoot that entire brutal season without losing a single person from the ones who didn't. Not better boots, not more supplies. A route that lived inside the memory and the daily judgment of people who had never stopped paying attention to what the snow was telling them and who were willing to say no flatly to men who had gambled everything to get there and did not want to hear it. The stampeders who turned back that Palm Sunday morning went on to reach the Klondike anyway, just a little later than they'd planned. Some found gold. Most, like the vast majority of the 100,000 people who set out for the Yukon, did not and came home with nothing but the trip itself. But every single one of them came home, and for decades afterward, when survivors of that gold rush told stories about the Chilkoot, the detail that stuck with almost all of them wasn't the gold at all. It was the morning a handful of men who knew that mountain better than anyone alive looked at the sky and simply refused to climb, no matter how much money was riding on the decision. Historians studying the Klondike Gold Rush today generally agree on the basic facts of the Palm Sunday avalanche: the death toll, the sequence of slides, the role Tlingit packers played in warning stampeders beforehand. What's harder to reconstruct more than a century later is the exact texture of those final conversations at sheep camp. Who said what to whom, in what words, in what order, before the mountain made the argument for them. Oral accounts collected from survivors in the years that followed don't always agree on the details. Some remember a single clear warning. Others remember it as something closer to an argument. Packers refusing outright, stampeders accusing them of trying to extort a better price for waiting out the day. What almost none of the survivor accounts disagree on is the outcome. The people who listened lived. The people who didn't, in devastating numbers, didn't. That's the part of this story that keeps historians and disaster researchers coming back to the Chilkoot more than 100 years later, and it isn't really about snow science at all. It's about what happens when accumulated. Lived knowledge runs directly into deadline pressure and desperation. Every stampeder standing at sheep camp that morning had already spent months of savings, sometimes years, just to reach that trailhead. Behind them was a line of thousands more people waiting for their own turn to climb. In front of them was a brief window of clear sky after 2 weeks of storms. Under almost any other circumstance, turning back on a warning from a local guide would have been the obvious, easy choice. On that particular morning, with that particular pressure sitting on 200 people's shoulders, it turned out to be one of the hardest decisions a person can make, and most of them made it wrong. What the mountain did that day wasn't cruelty and it wasn't random. It was the same slope behaving exactly the way people who understood it said it would. The tragedy sits entirely in the gap between what was known and who was listening. More than a century later, the Chilkoot Trail is a protected historic route walked today by hikers rather than gold seekers. The rusted supply caches and old boot leather still visible along parts of the path as a kind of open-air museum to what that season cost. Modern avalanche researchers still study the Palm Sunday slide as a textbook case, the exact combination of heavy new snowfall, rapid warming, and steep terrain that remains one of the most dangerous and most recognizable avalanche patterns anywhere in the world. The science eventually caught up to what Tlingit guides already understood by instinct and generational memory back in 1898. It just took the rest of North America a lot longer and cost a lot more to learn it. The pattern underneath this story isn't really about snow, and it isn't really about gold either. It's about the specific kind of arrogance that shows up whenever people in a hurry decide that the person who actually knows the terrain is an obstacle instead of the only reason they might survive it. It happened on a mountain in Alaska in 1898. It has happened in one form or another in nearly every gold rush, every expedition, every reckless crossing of unfamiliar ground in human history, because the math never changes. Local knowledge is slow. Local knowledge says wait. And desperation almost never wants to hear it. All right? If you want to understand how 100,000 people convinced themselves that a frozen mountain pass was worth crossing 30 times on foot for a chance at gold, most of them would never find. This channel covers exactly that kind of history, the forgotten records, the overlooked warnings, and the moments buried under a century of dust that still explain how people actually behaved when everything was on the line. Consider subscribing if that's the kind of story you came here for. So the next time you hear about a disaster that came out of nowhere, it's worth asking who exactly it came out of nowhere for. On the Chilkoot that Palm Sunday, it wasn't the mountain that failed to give warning. It was the warning that failed to survive contact with how badly people wanted to believe they didn't need it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.